my older brother Aiden spent most of his free time outdoors, hiking long distances, mountain bike riding, bow hunting, tent camping, canoeing, kayaking. I don't know how he found the time or the money, or how he always managed to find someone to go with him. He couldn't usually convince me. We were different breeds. I wouldn't call him an adrenaline junkie. Most of what he liked to do was relatively safe, but even at 35 years old, he definitely liked to be in motion. I'd only ever seen him slow down when he got into a serious relationship. Until he met Maxine, the girls he linked with stayed out of his activities for the most part. He would split his time between adventure and romance, but Maxine changed everything. Any idea Aiden pitched, a 3-day hike, magnet fishing near an old Civil War battleground, even camping on a mountain, Maxine wanted in. This story really began when Aiden asked me for a simple favor. He was taking Maxine up north about 30 miles to kayak down the Kelling River. He chose the small town of Carrington just a few miles south of here as their point B, where he asked me to pick them up. For Aiden and Maxine, this brief adventure was nothing more than a way to kill a Sunday afternoon. Without anything going on, I quickly agreed. Aiden told me they expected to arrive at approximately 5 p.m., but not to be alarmed if it took an extra hour or so based on the current. He said, "And who knows, we might run into a spot or two to stop off and check something out. I'll do my best to keep you updated as long as we have cell service." I said I'd bring a book and expect to wait. Maybe I should explain the Kelling River, since I'm guessing most of you haven't heard of it. It runs through about 100 miles of untouched forests and wetlands. It can be difficult to navigate, especially if the water is too low or too high, because it's easy to become lost among the various offshoots and tributaries. It is, however, very remote, and Aiden was right to question the reliability of cell service. As promised, I headed down to Point B and arrived a little before 5. The evening felt relaxed. The sun had just begun to retire after baking the earth all day, and a delightful breeze, the kind that makes you feel excited for some reason, blew up from the river coursing in front of my truck. I had tossed a lawn chair into the bed of my pickup, which I now set at the end of a concrete boat ramp next to the quiet river. Up close, I saw how deceptive the Kelling can be. It appeared calm, waveless from a distance, and it barely made a sound. Yet, at its edge, I could see small sticks and leaves rushing by at breakneck speed. I thought if I touched my foot to that water, I might get sucked away. I hoped Aiden and Maxine had a good plan for getting off the water once they reached me, because the next access was another 10 miles south. It would be dark by the time they reached it. I wasn't worried, though, even as 6 o'clock loomed and the sun's crest shimmered on the horizon. I mean, come on, it was Aiden. Even when things went horribly wrong, like when his tent got shredded by a bear while he and a friend were 2 days deep in the woods, he always figured out how to make it back, and always with a big smile. It seemed like he could never be defeated, my brother. Hardship, difficulty, challenges motivated him. I tried calling his cell phone around 6:30. He didn't answer. I needed to do something with the nervous energy building in my legs, so I hiked up the river toward a bend on which a cluster of trees grew diagonally outward. The trees blocked my view, so I wanted to pass through them to see further up the river. Maybe Aiden and Maxine got caught somewhere nearby, I hoped. Or maybe I would see them floating down to meet me as planned, just a little later than expected. But my hope felt hollow. Something felt different. Something felt wrong. Dread felt like a physical presence walking with me up the river, a silent companion waiting patiently to speak, and I did not want to hear what it had to say. I walked through the trees, finding the river once more. Here I could see a straight section maybe half a mile long, but no sign of Aiden or Maxine. Dread breathed down my neck. Soon, very soon, night would fall. I didn't remember seeing Aiden pack any flashlights into the kayaks. I'm sure he had 1 or 2 small ones amongst his gear, but not the big, powerful ones he always took on overnight trips. To see anything after sundown out there in the wetlands and marshes, he and Maxine would need those. I started running scenarios through my mind on the way back to my truck 10 minutes later. I wondered if one of them had capsized, maybe gotten hurt, and they had to get off the water. If they didn't have cell service, maybe they were out there waiting for me to call help for them. Maybe Aiden wasn't answering his phone because he lost it to the river during whatever accident waylaid them. I realized I was looking for excuses not to call 911 because that would make this situation feel irreversibly real. Even as 7 o'clock approached, I still half expected to see them come paddling toward the boat ramp with apologetic smiles on their shining faces. But I decided I could not waste any more time if my brother and his girlfriend were really in trouble. Better to call for help they didn't actually need than to make them wait. I called and was eventually directed to a fish and game warden who told me water levels were abnormally high, making the wetlands difficult to navigate. He said typically narrow or shallow channels could be perfectly navigable in a kayak, and if my brother didn't know exactly where he was going, he could have easily become lost in the maze of tributaries out in one of the flat marshes. That could mean, as the warden explained, Aiden and Maxine might still be on their way if it took them a while to find their way back to the river. And when I mentioned Aiden was an experienced outdoorsman, the warden seemed to lose any semblance of urgency. "If you still haven't seen or heard from him by sunrise tomorrow, we'll launch a team to go looking," he told me. He said, "As it stands now, we'd have very little chance of finding anybody in the dark, and we'd be putting more people at risk. I'm sure that's not what you want to hear, but it's the best answer I can give you, I'm afraid." I thanked him and told him I would call back in the morning if Aiden failed to arrive. I didn't bring any food with me, just one water bottle that was already half empty and warm. I couldn't leave, though. I didn't want Aiden and Maxine showing up in the dark to an empty boat ramp. I sat in the pickup, watching the river for as long as I could keep my eyes open, but at some point, I accidentally let them close. A sound outside the truck woke me up a few minutes after midnight. I heard only its echo after I awoke, but it sounded like a short yell or scream. If it came from a human, which I could not decide for certain it had, it could have been either Aiden or Maxine. It was too washed out and distant to tell. Stepping out of the truck into the midnight chill, I listened, debating whether to yell back in case it was Aiden or Maxine out there. I watched the black river flowing by, its subtle power barely notable under the moon and stars. I checked my phone for messages. Just in case, I tried calling Aiden's phone again, as well as Maxine's, but both went straight to voicemail, meaning their phones were either off or still outside service range. To me, that solidified the idea that they became stranded somewhere upriver and hadn't moved since. Otherwise, one of them eventually would have reached an area with at least enough signal to shoot off a text. They both had my number. What were the odds both of them lost their phones, I wondered. I heard it again, a strained howl from somewhere up the river. It sounded far away, but close enough for me to hear, which meant close enough for me to reach on foot. It could have been an animal, like a bobcat or even a mountain lion, I shuddered to think, although I wasn't sure if those predators were common in the area. I thought if I called 911 again, that's likely what they would tell me, though. They may have also made me go home, since I'm pretty sure there are ordinances against sleeping in your vehicle on state land, and all the parks technically close at 10:30 around here. I kept some fishing gear stuffed in the back seat of my truck, a pair of waders, rubber boots, and a light jacket. I also had a decent flashlight in the glove box for roadside emergencies. I took it all out, put it on, and faced the marshy wilderness. It could have entirely been my imagination, but the trees ahead seemed to part, as if welcoming me. The sense of foreboding which came over me was unmatched by any feeling I'd experienced up to that point, but that distant cry kept playing in my mind on repeat, sounding more and more like my brother's voice with each mental echo. I began my search by returning to that place through the trees where I could see a good distance upriver. In such an isolated place, I wish I could say I felt alone. Dread once again joined me, walking right alongside me, looming over me like the skinny trees. I could also feel other things watching. Animals, perhaps. Animals, I hoped. My dad's old saying kept coming to mind. They're more afraid of you than you are of them. A comforting thought I found very hard to believe amongst those black trees. I continued beyond where I'd stopped the first time, the ground rapidly softening beneath my feet. The trees fell behind me as tall grasses took their place. The grasses whispered incessantly, and I wish I could say that's just a cliché, but the sounds they made truly sounded like human voices conspiring all around me. Soon my boots began to stick each time I raised one of my feet to take a step. I moved further from the bank in search of more solid ground, but found the sticky wetness spread far from the river. I knew I must be approaching the marsh. Now the only trees in sight stood across the river from me. Everything on my side looked flat and barren, and if it were not for the height of the grasses, I could have easily seen that Aiden and Maxine were nowhere within sight. It occurred to me that I could be on the wrong side of the river, but there wasn't much I could do about that. I checked my cell phone and saw I'd already left the service area. It was then I realized just how isolated and alone I'd become. I felt like an idiot. If something happened to me out there, who would even know? Who would send help for me or for Aiden and Maxine? Was I dooming us all? As if sensing my impending intention to abandon the mission, that high voice cried out again. It carried over the open marsh without echoing, just expanding. I still could not tell whether it belonged to a human or another creature. I felt pretty certain the voice sounded too high to belong to Aiden, but it could have been Maxine, and as long as there remained any possibility it belonged to one of them, I resolved to continue at least until the marsh prevented me from traveling any further on foot. As I continued, trudging through thick mud and shallow water, it occurred to me no wildlife had crossed my path at any point. This sort of habitat should have hosted numerous types of birds, insects, reptiles, and amphibians, but not so much as a splashing fish had caught my attention. It seemed the entire area had been abandoned, left to exist on its own. I began to search for any type of creature, no matter how small, just to feel less alone. But my flashlight found nothing living except the whispering grass. The only creature out there with me was whatever kept making that deathly screaming sound, unless you count the towering figure of dread, which followed closely on my heels, waiting for me to trip or get trapped in the mud so it could swallow me. A stray tributary cut across my path, blocking me from progressing forward. I could have chosen to travel in either direction, one taking me further from the river, the other back toward it. I chose neither path for an unmeasured length of time. I would occasionally shut off my flashlight and sink into the tall grass to hide, my objective being to extort another sound from the person or creature which had led me this far. I failed with each attempt, and my nerves never allowed me to linger in the darkness for too long. Eventually, I made up my mind to return to the river. If Aiden and Maxine had followed the tributary, or any similar channel, I stood little chance of finding them anyway. Out in those wetlands, the channels all fed shallow pools of various sizes, each with their own offshoots which split in any given direction. Following this one deeper seemed foolish, although I had yet to determine how I would cross it. The river sounded louder at the section I returned to. Perhaps the eerie stillness of the night air allowed more space for it to rumble. I pointed my light as far as it would reach in search of abandoned kayaks, backpacks, trash, water bottles, anything which might indicate someone had passed through or stopped nearby. Finding nothing, I turned my search toward a way to find the trickling tributary blocking me. I could not determine its depth and dared not attempt to wade through with the prevalent risk of becoming stuck in its muddy bed. Close to the channel's mouth, I found a single black stone, shiny and smooth under the moonlight, positioned about halfway between myself and the opposite bank. It looked slippery, and my boots were slick with marsh slime, but since I had found no better option, no alternative at all, I leapt to the stone. My prediction came true. The film filling my boot's tread made my connection with the stone tenuous and brief, and before my left foot touched the stone's surface, my right foot slid forward. I would have toppled backward into the water if the stone itself did not rock and sink with my momentum and dump me toward the opposite bank. I crashed into the tributary, sloshing cold water into my boots and filling the bottoms of my waders up to my knees. Fulfilling yet another prediction, my right boot sunk deep into the muddy bed and became so stuck I could not escape. The force I exerted to extract it immediately sunk my left boot deeper with no benefit, so I paused my effort to collect myself and think. I watched the black stone which I had used to cross rock back into its original position. The way it turned over seemed out of sync with the soft current, so I watched it intently even as I felt my one free foot sinking deeper into the mud. The stone, the black shape, rocked forward and slowly dipped under the surface, moving with a life and will of its own. And I realized it was no stone at all, but rather the back of some other part of a creature submerged in the murky water. Reaching behind myself to clutch a cluster of long grass, I yanked myself free from my boots and pulled myself across the remaining distance to the bank. I crawled across the mud, water pouring out of my waders, until I put a few yards between myself and the tributary. Only then did I look back to see what, if anything, would emerge to pursue me. But nothing rose from the water. Nothing followed me up the bank. I heard only the sound of the river and felt only the presence of dread standing near me, looming over me, offering no assistance but to motivate me onward for my own sake as well as my brother's. I cared for Maxine as a fellow human being, but admittedly no more. I can honestly tell you I would not have put myself through that terror for her alone. My reckless actions and stupid choices could only have been motivated by a familial bond, the feeling that I would never be able to live with myself if I waited in my truck while some terrible fate befell my brother. What little help I could be to him, barefoot and defenseless without even a cell signal, never crossed my mind. Never in any true sense. It didn't matter, honestly. I just needed to find him. Thanks to the tributary behind me, I had no choice but to continue onward anyway. Barefoot, wet, and more than a little scared, I waded, crawled, and, when I could, walked through the marsh, following a westward curve in the river. The rumbling sound grew louder at a rate rapid enough for me to notice. It almost sounded like a waterfall up ahead, which excited me and my companion Dread equally. What if Aiden and Maxine fell over an uncharted drop? How thorough had my brother been in his planning? It wouldn't be like him to set out on an expedition he didn't research every detail of, but how much was known about this vast wetland and the river coursing through it? The entire area held a dark mystique and, if you'll allow me to speak abstractly, a feeling of malleability. Of course, such an area always shifts and changes as water levels rise and fall, drowning and carving the earth, but I think what I sensed that night was a force more controlled than the water. I felt, again rather abstractly, as if I were being led toward some predetermined fate or destination. I hoped and prayed that what awaited me was my brother, though admittedly the more time passed, the less likely this outcome seemed. The marsh transformed into a swamp over the next quarter of a mile. I soon found it difficult to find any semi-solid ground on which to tread. Without a boat, I worried my progress might soon stall. I climbed over exposed roots or trees and logs, the whole time thinking I would not be able to continue much further. Yet, if I could not push any further, and I could not return the way I'd come, what was I to do? My jungle gym path of roots and logs had led me away from the river, but fortunately the westward bend I'd been following cut sharply in front of me up ahead. I could hear the rumbling water louder than ever. And just as I worked up the nerve to make a long leap from one tree to the next, I heard that shrieking cry cut through the swamp from what sounded like directly ahead of me. It caused me to hesitate, but my legs were already sprung. I fell into the scummy water, my hands sinking into the mud below. My first reaction was to raise the flashlight, my only hope of finding my way back before dawn, out of the water in a desperate attempt to save it. But when I lifted it out of the water, no light shone from it anymore. After clambering to my feet, I flipped its switch on and off, repeatedly, without result. Resting my back against a tree and planting one foot in its roots, I twisted the top of the flashlight and dumped swamp water out of the battery chamber. When I replaced the top, 3 brief, faint flickers gave me hope before the light went dark for good. I attempted to use my tiny Nokia phone to light the way. Tucked in my pocket underneath my waders, it had gotten damp, but not soaked. It still worked, but it did not produce enough light to justify occupying one of my hands. I also noted I still did not have a signal. I wonder to this day if the towers simply could not reach that remote area, or if something out there was blocking their waves, keeping them out like a dome over the wetland. Nearly blind, I followed the sound of the river. I knew at the river's side I would at least receive the grace of moonlight. Now completely soaked, I made quicker progress through the swamp, not caring if I needed to wade through water as deep as my hips. It's not like I'd seen a single other living creature to fear, unless, of course, the stone I jumped on really was something else. When I reached the river's edge again, I thought my eyes deceived me. I figured some shadow from one of the trees or perhaps a dense cloud overhead was creating an optical illusion on the water, but that would not have explained the sound. The sound like a waterfall. I walked closer to this place and knew it was no illusion at all, but I still could not explain it. In a straight line running from bank to bank, the river's flow suddenly dropped into a shadowy chasm. The falling water reverberated as it descended into a bottomless cavern, vanishing in blackness. But then, only a few feet downstream of this sudden and sheer drop, the river re-emerged, gushing upward before continuing its southward flow. It looked as if an enormous soundless motor was churning the water back up from the mysterious depth. I knew now why Aiden and Maxine failed to reach Point B. This monstrous fall likely would have been invisible until they were right upon it. And just because the river was able to re-emerge from it to continue unencumbered, who's to say 2 human beings could do the same? What did they meet at the bottom of that chasm? How far did they fall? Standing beside this anomaly, I noted a low humming through the roar of the gushing water. It did not sound mechanical or electronic, but rather similar to a deep voice humming, like a monk high on a mountain whose voice was carrying down across space and time to meet me there, although the longer I listened, the less human it sounded. I stared into the darkness between the descending and resurrected halves of the river for a temporary eternity. I'm not sure I could have looked away or moved if I had wanted to, but it didn't matter, because I didn't want to. The anomaly transfixed me, holding my feet firmer than the soft mud slowly sucking me down. Twice I caught myself leaning toward the bottomless void, barely as wide as I am tall. Twice I pulled myself back. Neither time did the peculiar gravity of the gap alarm me or prompt me to move away from it. I can't truthfully explain why. I can only say that the impossible chasm possessed a strange, seductive quality. The call of the void. And then it did call to me directly. I heard one final time that shriek, that cry, that desperate voice. Only this time its non-verbal tone seemed to morph into my name as it echoed in my head. I turned my attention from the void to the water gurgling out of it, flowing onward, yet seemingly changed somehow. Purified in some manner I could detect even under the faint moonlight. It shimmered brighter than the water flowing in. I wanted to be purified in the same way. Deep down I ached, knowing my brother was lost. I wanted that pain to vanish. I wanted to carry on, purified like the river. But all of these feelings occurred far below the surface of my thoughts. At the forefront of my mind, there was only the void. The void and the looming figure of dread. And then dread gave me a push. The call of serenity convinced me not to resist. I fell, and I continued to fall. And everything was dark, and everything ended. I'd found the end of everything. And it was a beginning. Below the blackness, I found light, a full spectrum of color. I felt the most serene sense of belonging, and for a long time I forgot the life I'd left behind. I wandered there amongst the colors and light for yet another eternity, comprehending nothing yet understanding everything, until a wave swept my feet, turning me upside down and dragging me up, and spitting me out into the cold river, back in the complex world of pain and strife and the necessity to survive. My awakening happened abruptly as I quickly realized I was going to drown if I did not take control of my body, a body which I had not been able to feel for what felt like weeks, months, or even years. I am describing these feelings and events exactly as I recall them, I promise. If it sounds like I've lost my mind, I can only agree. It felt like awakening from a dream, only instead of sweaty sheets, I was entangled in twisting waves of icy water which threatened me with something I had not considered or feared for yet another fleeting eternity. Death. To fight the current proved futile, so instead I rode it until the river broke out into tributaries and saturated the wetlands I had crawled through before. I swam with the gentle flow, conserving my energy until the river fed me into a channel which may have been the same I'd crossed earlier that night, or perhaps years before. Time felt so abstract to me, and even though it was still dark and the moon still hung high in the sky, maybe where it had been when I fell, maybe not, I feared an enormous amount of time had passed while I'd been inside that endless void. As difficult as I find describing what occurred to me down there, I find it nearly impossible to describe the events following my return. Ironically, my subsequent experiences in the physical world seem more dreamlike than those that happened in the void. I nearly let myself drown, wondering if I might wake up, but primitive instincts I'd all but forgotten forced me to swim out of the water as soon as the current washed me near the bank. Almost exactly where I emerged, I found a waterlogged kayak caught amongst the grasses. Even in the dark, and even though it was now crusty with mud and overgrown algae, I recognized it as Aiden's. This discovery empowered the notion that I was dreaming, for how could I have missed my brother's kayak as I journeyed along the river before, and why would it look so old now? Yet I continued. Still barefoot, still wearing my heavy waders, I journeyed all the way back to the boat ramp where I was supposed to meet Aiden and Maxine. A part of me expected to find them waiting there for me by the pickup truck, questioning where I had gone and what had taken me so long to return. But not even my truck waited at Point B. I found an empty boat ramp, and beside it, 3 wooden crosses covered with moss leaned out of the dirt. The one with my name had fallen into more of an X shape. When I broke moss away from the crossbeams of the other 2, I read the names of my brother and his girlfriend. How, I wondered. How had enough time passed for our families to realize we'd vanished and for them to give up on finding us to the point of erecting these memorials? And how had enough time passed for the memorials to begin falling apart, for nature to begin to claim them, as our parents must have assumed it claimed our bodies and lives? I pondered these questions as I walked along the road, unsure what I would find in this familiar yet bizarre new world. Before long, and to my great surprise, I found a 24/7 gas station I didn't remember being there, attended by a clerk who called the police for me. An officer came, listened to my story, and probably believed I'd hit my head after falling in the river. She took me to the hospital for an evaluation where they confirmed my identity, and I, Silas Abner, was reintroduced to the world. 22 years after my disappearance. This world is nearly unrecognizable from the one I left behind in 2003. I felt so disoriented upon my return. But fortunately, someone has been here to guide me through the new reality. My big brother Aiden. Aiden reemerged in 2017. He's spent the last 8 years trying to learn about that chasm we fell into and what it contains. He says when he returned and learned I'd gone missing, he wondered if I'd managed to find the same rift, that cavernous fissure, and fell in as well. His return revived the search for me. Even though our parents are now aged, weathered by time and grief, they followed him out into those wetlands to find me, to try to drag me out of the void. But they could not find it. Apparently, it is not a permanent fixture, but comes and goes under circumstances I'm not sure we'll ever fully know. Aiden had thought it closed forever, but then in 2022, Maxine had wandered into the same gas station I found the night I returned and told a very similar story. She and Aiden shared many private conversations and included me in some after I reappeared. We all tried to make sense of our experience, but then Maxine went her separate way, and we have not seen or spoken to her since. I think she wants to forget. Aiden says he once tried to forget, but like me, he cannot. I don't think I want to. I've seen the fabric of the universe firsthand, and while the experience terrified me, it's left me with an indestructible hope as well. When life begins to feel like a turbulent river, I tell myself to just keep my head above water. We were all born into this experience, dropped off at point A, and somewhere downstream we'll reach point B. Someday you will understand. It is an end, and it is a beginning. Someday, I'll see you there. You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and bonus Into the Woods episodes, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram at The Warning Woods, and if you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.